Caiaphas won. Rome was satisfied. The Sanhedrin was satisfied. The Sadducee families who had lifted him into the most sacred office in Israel were satisfied. The problem had been handled quietly in a single night before the festival crowds ever woke up. But there is a detail almost no one knows. After he secured the conviction of Jesus of Nazareth, Caiaphas remained high priest for at least 6 more years. 6 more years in the same chamber. 6 more years on the same seat. And in every one of those years, he had to face something he never planned for. The followers of the Galilean he had executed didn't scatter. They multiplied. And each time one of them was dragged before the same council that had condemned their teacher, Caiaphas found himself looking into the face of a man who was not afraid of him. For someone whose entire authority ran on fear, that was not an inconvenience. That was a nightmare. What happened to Caiaphas after the crucifixion is not a footnote to the story. It is one of the clearest records we have of what happens when human power tries to stop something God has already set in motion. To understand how it ended, we first have to understand exactly who this man was, and how much he had riding on, staying exactly where he was. His full name was Joseph, son of Caiaphas, Yehoseph bar Caiapha, and he did not arrive at the high priesthood through a calling. Under the law of Moses, the high priesthood was a lifetime office, inherited within the line of Aaron. It was not supposed to be given, it was not supposed to be taken away. A man held it until he died, and then his son held it. By the time Joseph, son of Caiaphas, put on those garments, that system had been dead for almost a century. Under Roman occupation, the high priesthood had become something else entirely. A political appointment, handed out and revoked at the pleasure of whichever Roman official happened to be governing Judea that year. The most sacred office in Israel had become a job you could lose, and Rome fired people constantly. Look at the record just before Caiaphas. The prefect Valerius Gratus arrived in Judea around the year 15. In roughly 4 years, he removed and replaced the high priest 4 separate times: Annas, Ishmael, Eleazar, Simon. 4 men, 4 sets of vestments, 4 ceremonies, burned through in the time it takes to build a house. Then Gratus appointed Joseph, son of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas held the office for 18 years. If you are finding this useful, take 1 second and subscribe. We are working through the entire trial of Jesus, 1 person at a time, and I do not want you to miss the next one. 18 years. Think about what that number actually means. 4 men could not survive 4 years. This one man survived 18 through the entire tenure of Pontius Pilate, and then some. That is not luck. That is not piety. That is a specific and rare kind of skill. Caiaphas was extraordinarily good at one thing: keeping Rome comfortable. And he had help. He was married to the daughter of Annas, the same Annas that Gratus had removed years earlier. Annas was not a man who disappeared when he lost his title. He built something better than a title. He built a dynasty. 5 of his sons would eventually hold the high priesthood, and his son-in-law held it longer than any of them. The historian Josephus, writing decades later, describes the house of Annas as one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Jerusalem. Their income came from the temple. Their authority came from Rome. And their survival depended on those 2 things never coming into conflict. Now, here is the detail that tells you everything about the position Caiaphas actually occupied. The high priest's vestments, the ephod, the breastpiece set with 12 stones, the blue robe hung with bells and pomegranates, the linen turban bearing the golden plate engraved "Holy to the Lord." Those garments did not belong to the high priest. Rome kept them. They were stored in the Antonia fortress, the Roman barracks built against the northwest corner of the temple platform, locked in a stone chamber under a Roman seal. They were released to the priests 7 days before each major festival, and then handed back. Read that again. The most sacred garments in Judaism, the ones worn into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, were kept in a Roman storeroom and loaned out on a schedule. Every year, 3 times a year, Caiaphas had to send men to a Roman garrison to ask for his own robes. That was the leash. and he had worn it for 18 years without once pulling against it. Now I need to tell you something about what Caiaphas actually believed, because almost nobody explains this part, and without it, the rest of the story does not make sense. Caiaphas was a Sadducee. In the 1st century, Judaism was not one thing. There were parties, and they disagreed sharply. The Pharisees, the group most people have heard of, believed in the resurrection of the dead, in angels, in spirits, in a coming judgment, and in a body of oral tradition alongside the written law. They were popular, they were mostly not wealthy. Their power base was the synagogue and the crowd. The Sadducees were the opposite in almost every respect. They were the aristocracy, the priestly families, the men who controlled the temple. They accepted the written law and rejected the oral tradition. And on the question that would eventually matter more than any other, they held a position the Pharisees found unthinkable. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Luke states it flatly in Acts 23, verse 8. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits. No resurrection. No afterlife in the sense most people imagine. This life, this covenant, this temple, this nation. That was the whole account. Hold on to that. It is going to come back with tremendous force, because if you believe there is nothing after this, then this, the temple, the priesthood, the arrangement that keeps the nation alive, is not one thing among many things you are protecting. It is everything you have, and it paid extraordinarily well. The temple was not only a place of worship, it was the financial center of Judea. Every Jewish man over 20 owed an annual half-shekel temple tax. It could not be paid in Roman coin because Roman coin carried the emperor's image and an inscription declaring him divine, so it had to be exchanged. And the coin the temple accepted was the Tyrian shekel, valued for its silver purity, which means every pilgrim arriving in Jerusalem had to change money at a rate set by the temple. Then there were the animals. A pilgrim traveling 4 days from Galilee could bring a lamb, but the animal had to pass inspection for defects, and inspection happened at the temple. Or you could simply buy an animal already certified, on site, at temple prices. Later, rabbinic sources refer bitterly to something called the Bazaar of the Sons of Annas, the market concession operating in the temple courts under the control of the high priestly family. Those sources are written later, and their tone is polemical, so take the label loosely. But the underlying arrangement is not in dispute. The family of Annas made a great deal of money from the traffic through those courts. So when a preacher from Galilee walked into the temple courts during Passover week and overturned the tables of the money changers, Caiaphas was not looking at a theological dispute. He was not even only looking at a public order problem. He was looking at a man who had walked into the family business and turned it over in front of the largest crowd of the year. He was looking at the one thing that could get his robes taken away permanently, because Passover was the dangerous week. Jerusalem's normal population swelled several times over. Pilate moved up from Caesarea with additional troops specifically because Passover was when uprisings started. Roman soldiers were stationed on the temple porticos watching the crowds from above. And into that, a man rides in on a donkey while people throw their cloaks in the road and shout about a kingdom. Caiaphas had spent 18 years making sure Rome never had a reason to look closely at Jerusalem. And now Rome was looking. There is a passage in the Gospel of John that most people read past, and it is the single most important thing ever recorded about how Caiaphas thought. John chapter 11, verse 49. The council has gathered. They are worried. Word has spread that Jesus raised a man named Lazarus in Bethany, 4 kilometers from where they are sitting, and the crowds are growing. Someone says out loud what they are all afraid of. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. And Caiaphas answers them, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." Stop there. Notice what is absent from that sentence. There is no accusation of heresy. There is no theological argument. There is no rage. There is arithmetic. One man against a nation. One life against the temple, the priesthood, the fragile arrangement with Rome that had held for 18 years. Put like that, it is not even a difficult decision. Any competent administrator would make the same call. That is what makes Caiaphas genuinely frightening, and it is why his story is worth 40 minutes of your time. He was not a monster. He was a manager. He did the math, and the math came out clean, and John adds something extraordinary right after. He writes that Caiaphas did not say this on his own, but that as high priest that year he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not only for that nation, but to gather into one the scattered children of God. The man was telling the truth. He just had no idea what he was saying. Now picture the night itself. It is the 14th of Nisan. The city is packed. Lambs have been selected. Families are preparing. And sometime after dark, an armed detachment moves out of the city, crosses the Kidron Valley, and climbs into an olive grove on the western slope of the Mount of Olives. They come back with a prisoner. What follows over the next several hours is a legal proceeding that violates, by the standards later recorded in Jewish law itself, nearly every rule that was supposed to govern a capital trial. Capital cases were to be tried during daylight. This one ran at night. A guilty verdict in a capital case was not to be delivered on the same day the trial began. This one was. Trials were not to be held on the eve of a Sabbath or a festival. This was the eve of both. Now, we should be careful here, because those rules come from the Mishnah, compiled roughly 2 centuries later, and scholars genuinely argue about how much of it applied in the year 33. That is an honest caveat, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But even setting the Mishnah aside completely, the Gospel accounts themselves describe a proceeding that is visibly rushed. Witnesses are brought in, and their testimony does not agree. Mark says explicitly that many testified falsely, but their statements did not agree. The case is falling apart in real time. And then Caiaphas does something a prosecutor does when the evidence has collapsed. He stops using witnesses and questions the defendant directly. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answers him. At that, Caiaphas tears his own garments, a formal ritual gesture of a judge hearing blasphemy, and asks the council why they need any more witnesses. The verdict comes back, and while that is happening inside, something else is happening outside, in the same building. All 4 Gospels place Peter in the courtyard of the high priest's house that night. Caiaphas's house. There is a fire lit in the open court because it is cold, and Peter is standing at it with the servants and the guards, warming his hands, close enough to the proceedings to hear how they are going. A servant girl looks at him and says, "He was with the Galilean." He says he wasn't. It happens twice more. The 3rd time, someone points out that his accent gives him away. A Galilean cannot hide in a Jerusalem courtyard by talking. And Peter swears he does not know the man. Then the rooster crows. I want you to hold those 2 rooms side by side for a second, because they are maybe 15 meters apart. In one room, the most powerful religious authority in Judea is tearing his robes and securing a death sentence, in full command of the situation. In the courtyard outside, the future leader of the movement is falling apart in front of a servant girl. If you had been standing between those 2 rooms that night, and someone asked you which of those 2 men would still matter in 2,000 years, the answer would have been obvious. It would also have been wrong. Remember that courtyard. We are coming back to it. But here is the part that gets skipped. The Sanhedrin's verdict was worth nothing on its own. Under Roman rule, the council could not carry out an execution. Only the prefect could. And Pilate did not care even slightly about a religious charge inside a Judean sect. So the charge changed. Before the council, the accusation was blasphemy. Before Pilate, it became something Rome would act on immediately. This man claims to be a king. That is sedition. That is treason against Caesar. And when Pilate hesitated, and every gospel records that he hesitated, the pressure applied to him was precisely calibrated. "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." That is a threat aimed at a Roman official's career, delivered by men who understood exactly how Roman careers ended. John records that the chief priests said, "We have no king but Caesar." From the men who kept the covenant of Israel on the eve of the feast celebrating deliverance from an empire, that sentence is one of the most extraordinary things in the entire New Testament. The strategy worked. Pilate signed off. Roman soldiers carried it out. By the time the sun set that Friday, the problem was solved. Caiaphas had managed it perfectly. No riot, no Roman crackdown, no investigation from Syria. The festival continued. The lambs were eaten. The city calmed down. He had every reason to believe it was over. It was not over, and the way he found out is recorded in detail. Open the book of Acts, chapter 4. Something has happened at the temple gate. A man who had been unable to walk his entire life, the text says he was over 40 years old, is standing up in the middle of the court in front of a crowd of people who had walked past him for decades. Peter and John are arrested and held overnight, and the next morning, the council convenes. Luke gives us the roster in Acts 4, verse 6. Annas, the high priest, Caiaphas, John, Alexander, all the men of the high priestly family, the same chamber, the same men, the same seats. And Luke tells us precisely what set them off. Acts 4, verse 2. They were disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. There it is. Remember what I told you about the Sadducees. No resurrection, no angels, no spirits. That was not a minor position for them. It was a defining one, the line that separated them from the Pharisees, the theological ground the entire aristocracy stood on. And two fishermen with no training were standing in the temple court telling a crowd that a man had come back from the dead. They were not just claiming something Caiaphas thought was false. They were claiming the one thing his entire worldview had no shelf for. If the resurrection was real, then the Sadducean account of reality was wrong at the foundation. And every calculation built on top of it, including the calculation that one man should die to save the nation, was wrong with it. That is why the response was so immediate and why it never stopped. I want to ask you something before we go on, and I would genuinely like to read your answer. Did you know that Caiaphas stayed in office for years after the crucifixion, and that the apostles were tried by the exact same court that condemned Jesus? Most people have never been told that. Tell me in the comments whether that is new to you. Now, put yourself in that room. Weeks earlier, these men had watched Peter's movement collapse. They had seen the disciples scatter into the dark. One of them had denied even knowing his teacher to a servant girl in the courtyard of the high priest's own house. And now that same man is standing in front of the Sanhedrin, and he is preaching to them. Luke records the council's reaction with a precision that is almost funny. They saw the courage of Peter and John, and they realized these were unschooled, ordinary men. Not trained, not credentialed, nobody, and they could not explain it, so they clear the chamber and confer privately, and Acts 4, verse 16, preserves what they said to each other when they thought no one was listening. What shall we do with these men? Everyone living in Jerusalem knows they have performed a notable sign, and we cannot deny it. We cannot deny it. That is not the sentence of men who believe they are dealing with a fraud. That is the sentence of men who have a problem they cannot make disappear. So they do the only thing left. They order them to stop speaking. And Peter answers with a line that must have landed in that room like a stone through glass. Judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. They threaten them further and let them go, because Luke says they were afraid of the people. 18 years of authority, and the council is now managing its own crowd. And then chapter 5 happens, and it gets worse for him in a way that is almost comic. The apostles are arrested again and put in the public jail overnight. In the morning, the council assembles in full. Luke says the full Sanhedrin, the entire Senate of Israel, and sends officers to bring the prisoners up. The officers come back and report that the jail is locked. securely, with the guards standing at the doors, and there is no one inside. While they are still trying to process that, someone arrives and says, "The men you put in jail are standing in the temple courts, teaching the people." Read the sequence again from the council's point of view. They arrested them. The men got out, and instead of leaving Jerusalem, instead of hiding, instead of doing any of the rational things a person does after escaping custody, they walked back to the exact place they were arrested and resumed doing the exact thing they were arrested for. You cannot threaten someone like that. There is nothing left to take. So the officers bring them in again. Luke notes carefully without force, because they feared the people would stone them. And the high priest confronts them with a sentence that says everything about where he now stands. Acts 5, verse 28. "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching." You have filled Jerusalem. That is the man who solved the problem, admitting out loud in his own council chamber roughly 2 years later that the problem now fills the entire city. And in the middle of that session, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, one of the most respected teachers of his generation, stands up and tells the council to leave the movement alone. If their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. The council takes the advice halfway. They do not execute anyone, but they have the apostles flogged before releasing them, the standard punishment, 39 lashes, administered publicly. And Luke records what those men did on the way out. Acts 5, verse 41. They left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Put yourself back in that chamber one more time. You have just applied the most severe penalty available to you short of death. And your prisoners walk out of the building happy. There is no lever left. That is the moment the council loses, and some of them must have known it. And this is essential, so let me say it plainly. The council was not united. Gamaliel was a Pharisee arguing for the apostles. Nicodemus, a member of that same council, had defended Jesus earlier. Joseph of Arimathea, also a member, took the body down and buried it in his own tomb. The men who drove the condemnation were a specific faction, the Sadducean high priestly aristocracy, whose wealth and position were tied directly to Rome. Not a people, a faction. And every single person in the movement they were trying to suppress was also Jewish. Peter, John, Stephen, Mary, all of them. This was a conflict inside one community, and anyone who tells the story as anything else is telling it wrong. Then comes chapter 6, and the pressure escalates into something worse. A man named Stephen is seized and brought before the council, and Stephen does not defend himself. He delivers the longest speech in the entire book of Acts, a walk through the whole history of Israel, ending in an accusation aimed straight at the men in front of him. They do not vote. They do not hand him to Pilate. They drag him outside the city wall and stone him. And Luke drops in a detail that will matter more than anyone in that room could possibly know. The witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. Here is the pattern Caiaphas could not break. He silenced Jesus and got 12 preachers. He arrested the 12, and the number in Jerusalem grew into the thousands. He killed Stephen, and the believers scattered out of Jerusalem, and carried the message into every town they scattered into. He authorized Saul to hunt them all the way to Damascus. And Saul came back as Paul. Every single measure he took made the thing larger. He was pressing down on something that grew in exactly the proportion he pressed. The end, when it came, had nothing to do with any of it. In the year 36, a man in Samaria gathered a crowd on Mount Gerizim, promising to uncover sacred vessels buried there by Moses. Pilate intercepted them with cavalry and infantry. People were killed. Leaders were executed afterward. The Samaritans went over Pilate's head and filed a formal complaint with Lucius Vitellius, the Roman legate of Syria, Pilate's superior and the most powerful Roman official in the eastern provinces. Vitellius acted. He ordered Pilate to Rome to answer for himself. And then, according to Josephus, Vitellius came down to Jerusalem himself for Passover. While he was there, he did 2 things. First, he returned custody of the high priest's vestments to the priests. After decades under Roman seal in the Antonia fortress, the garments came home. It was a gesture of goodwill toward a province that had just been badly handled, and the city celebrated it. Second, in the same visit, he removed Caiaphas from office and installed Jonathan, son of Annas, in his place. Consider the shape of that. For 18 years, Caiaphas had survived by being useful to Rome. He had made the hard call, taken the reputational damage, kept the peace through the most dangerous week of the year, and delivered exactly what the empire wanted. And Rome removed him in a single administrative decision on a routine visit as one item among two. The same power he had protected at every cost handed his office to his brother-in-law and moved on. If you have made it this far, subscribe. The next chapter of this story is going up in a few days, and it changes how this one reads. After that, Caiaphas vanishes. There is no record of his death, no account of his final years. Josephus, who tells us how he got the job and how he lost it, says nothing about what happened to him afterward. The man who held the highest office in Israel for 18 years exits history without a sentence. For 19 centuries, that was the end of it. And then, in November of 1990, a construction crew was building a water park in the Peace Forest in southern Jerusalem, and a bulldozer broke through the roof of a burial cave. Inside were 12 limestone ossuaries, bone boxes used in Jerusalem for roughly a 100-year window straddling the 1st century, in which the bones of the dead were collected a year after burial and stored permanently. One of them was among the most ornate ever recovered in Jerusalem. Deeply carved rosettes, elaborate borders. The kind of box a very wealthy family commissioned, and scratched into it, twice in Aramaic, was a name, Yehoseph bar Caiaphas, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Inside were the bones of 6 people, a woman, children, and a man who had died at roughly 60 years of age. Now, I have to be honest with you about the scholarship because you deserve the real picture. Most scholars accept the identification. A minority dispute it, arguing over the spelling of the name and whether the family was as unique as the identification assumes. A second ossuary, recovered from antiquities looters and authenticated in 2011, is inscribed for a woman described as a daughter of the Caiaphas priestly line, which strengthens the case considerably but does not close the argument entirely. So I will not overstate it. But I will leave you with the image, the most politically powerful religious figure in Roman Judea, the man who calculated that one life was an acceptable price, the man who wore garments Rome kept in a warehouse, found by accident, by a bulldozer, under a parking lot for a water park, while the movement he spent 6 years trying to suppress is, at the moment you are watching this, the largest religion on the planet. But there is one more thing, and it is the part that turns this from a story into a verdict. Go back to the sentence. It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. That was the trade. One life to save the temple and the nation. So let us check the receipts. The house of Annas kept the priesthood for another generation. And in the year 62, one of Annas's sons, Ananus, Caiaphas's brother-in-law, used a gap between Roman governors to convene the council and execute a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who led the church in Jerusalem. Josephus records it. The city was appalled, and Ananus was removed from office after 3 months. 4 years later, in 66, Judea rose against Rome, and in the first days of that revolt, the crowd in Jerusalem went for the aristocracy before they went for the Romans. They burned the public archives to destroy the debt records, and they burned the palace of the high priest. The house of Annas, the family that had held the priesthood for 60 years, was destroyed by its own city. Ananus himself was killed in the winter of 68, in the fighting inside Jerusalem. Josephus says his body was thrown out unburied, and in August of the year 70, the legions of Titus broke through the walls, and the temple burned, not damaged, not closed, burned to the ground and dismantled, with the sacrificial system that had run for 1,000 years ending in a single afternoon and never resuming to this day. The nation Caiaphas traded a life to preserve was gone within 40 years of the trade. The temple he protected was gone. The priesthood he held was gone. The family he married into was gone. The arrangement with Rome that he maintained for 18 careful years ended with Rome burning the building. Everything he was protecting was destroyed, and the one thing he sacrificed to protect it is the only thing from that entire world that is still standing. Here is what I keep coming back to with Caiaphas, and it is not what you would expect. He was not evil in any way he would have recognized. He was responsible. He was competent. He was protecting real people from a real empire that had really destroyed nations for less. When he said it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish, he was, by every standard of political judgment available to him, correct. That is the part that should stop you. Caiaphas did not fall because he was a villain. He fell because he was certain that he understood the situation, certain that he could see the whole board, certain that the reasonable thing and the right thing were the same thing, and he was standing in the room with God and did the math instead. The most dangerous position a person can occupy is not open rebellion. It is competent, well-intentioned, load-bearing certainty about something you have not actually looked at. He had 18 years of evidence that his approach worked. He had 6 more years to notice it wasn't working anymore. Every arrest that produced more preachers, every trial that produced more courage, every execution that spread the thing further. 6 years of data arriving in his own chamber, telling him the same thing. Gamaliel said it out loud. In his hearing, "You will not be able to stop these men." He heard it, and he went back to work. If this landed somewhere in you today, do one thing with it. Think of someone who is holding on with both hands to something God has been asking them to release. A position, a plan, an outcome they have decided is the only acceptable one. Someone who is not a bad person at all, just certain and tired and gripping. Send them this, not as a rebuke, as a story. Because sometimes a person cannot hear the thing directly, but they can hear it from 2,000 years away in the life of a man who was very good at his job and got the most important question of his life completely wrong. And there is one more thing you should know. Caiaphas did not build any of this. When the arrest happened, Jesus was taken first to a different house, to the man who had run the priesthood before him, whose 5 sons would run it after him, and who was still at that moment the most powerful man in Jerusalem. His father-in-law, Annas. That story is next. May the God who took the most calculated decision in history and turned it into the redemption of the world give you the courage to loosen your grip on whatever you are holding too tightly, and the peace of knowing that what he is building cannot be stopped by anyone, not even by the people who are certain.